So here's one question from our audience. Before taking the leap to start your startup, did you participate in any accelerator or incubators?
I personally not. So you have to take my feedback with a pinch of salt. I have been an advisor to a lot of accelerators and incubators. In general, I think it's 50-50 chance that it's a good accelerator or incubator. There definitely are some really good ones, but just like everything else, the outcome might not be great. I think the most important thing is if you're going to participate in accelerator incubator, be very sure of what the intellectual property rights are that you are agreeing to, because what you don't want to do is participate in the accelerator and then somebody else has an option on your idea. That's really important. If that's okay, I think if it's a 1 or 2 week accelerator, why not? Maybe you learn something from it. Maybe you meet people. I think that's a really good benefit from accelerators and incubators. You might meet team members that you might not know in your natural network. You've got to start somewhere, right? And that's probably a good place to start if you have little connections.
Which project did you find most rewarding or that you learned the most from?
That's a good question. I would say the one where I learned the most in a compressed period of time was building a FDA certified medical device at Google. It was not a natural move for Google to invest in that area. There was no institutional knowledge about how to do it. Google had never built a medical device before and had never met with the FDA. When the FDA heard that Google wanted to meet with them, they were shocked. They're like, what? I thought you guys built a search engine. So I learned a ton because it was an extremely well-funded project. There was tremendous amount of leadership support all the way down from the CEO, and we could hire the absolute best people. And so the fire hose was really big. And if you could sustain learning every day, then there was almost never a time when you walked away from work saying, wow, I didn't learn anything today. But every day was a mini mountain that you climbed on learning. So I guess that would be number one.
Which project or decision didn't work out for you in the past and how did you overcome it?
I think the hardest one for me was I started a company in the O's after I left IBM Research that's specialized in cluster computing and big data. I really believed that the future was big data and analytics. There was a number of companies that started at the same time. Splunk is one of them in IT management. And we kind of, as a group, everybody who participated as like the founding team members really felt that that was the future. I put a lot of my own I put a lot of effort into it, but I also invested some of my own beliefs and my own ideas of what my future would look like in that project. And when it failed, because we were way too early and we didn't build the right product, it felt like a personal failure to me, and it felt like the future that I predicted for myself, or the future that I saw for myself, was falling apart, and that I would not be able to recover, because where do you go after a failure like that? And I really had to rely on people around me to help me see that this doesn't mean that the next project is going to be a failure, and that shouldn't draw conclusions from it. But it was a tough time, and it took a while. It took about 2 years for me to really process it and digest it and see the potential of what could come. And so when a project did come up at VMware, I could once again work on an interesting technology. It gave me enough confidence to think that this wasn't the end for me, and there would be more. And so what the lesson I learned from it was recovery is very personal. For some people, they just bounce back immediately, and it's not a problem. For others, it takes longer and it's harder. And if you recognize, if you are self-aware enough that you're not going to bounce back, then you really need to look for help. You really need to ask friends, family, or even see a therapist on trying to process and overcome that failure. Because if you get stuck in believing that that failure mode is permanent, then it's not worth taking the risk in the first place. And a friend of mine who's really smart once told me, you should never start or take a risk if you're afraid of failing, because part of the process in learning is to fail. And you should do it because you're going to learn something, not because you want to succeed.
Well, that's powerful advice. So, besides this one, is there any other great advice that you have been given? Because you mentioned about a mentor a couple times, for startups.
Yeah, as I became more adept at navigating my own career, and every move that I made became less risky because I have more either career experience to fall back on or financial support. I was surprised about maybe 8, 9 years ago when somebody came to me and said, "So what? You are constantly building stuff, you are chasing, launching projects, you are building teams, but why are you doing it?" And I said, "Well, I like to do it," but I was challenged to think about to what end. And the question that surprised me was, imagine that you succeed at everything you try to do. What are you going to do with it? And I learned that for me, I've never really put myself in that position to think, oh, I'm going to succeed. What do I want to do with it? And do I even want to? Is the success going to get me somewhere that I want to be? And so, what I tell younger people who are on their way to being successful, and these days it's kind of interesting. There are quite a few people that are very fortunate. They start a company, the first company in their life. They just left university, or maybe they even dropped out early. And within 3 or 4 years, they have a startup that is on its way to IPO. That does happen. It's super rare. Don't believe the press. It doesn't happen to everybody. The failure rate is 90%. But if I'm a mentor to somebody like that, I always ask them, so to what end, right? You have to ask yourself the question, if you are going to be successful, you reach your destination, what do you do with it? And it's surprising how many people, including myself, have no idea how to answer that question. So I'm still working on it. I'm still trying to figure out what that means for me. But I think it's important to understand that if you take the first step in a journey and you reach your destination, what do you do with it?
Yeah, I like the quote, life is a journey, not a destination. What you just described, I think it resonates a lot. So how do you finding the talent these days? You're a CEO of a startup. What are some of the sources of the talent you're getting from?
Well, online recruiting is very robust. So Indeed is the largest driver of tech company recruiting in our experience. LinkedIn is closely second. And it's interesting because LinkedIn offers two types of products. There's the organic way of recruiting on LinkedIn, which is just exercising your network on LinkedIn with connections you have, sending messages, using LinkedIn as a communications platform. But LinkedIn itself also has a number of recruiting products and tools. What's really interesting about the recruiting process these days is that post COVID, or if we can call it post COVID, the shift to I want to work remote and that's how I want to be at the company. I don't want to come to an office is completely inverse of what it was before March of last year or even August of last year, because most people assume that they're going to work from an office. It's not even a question. It's like, I, I, I don't want to be a remote employee. I don't want to be a lone ranger. I don't want to work from home. I would say the vast majority of job seekers thought about the job market in that way. But what working from home for a year plus has done, especially in the tech space, is now the majority of people want to work from home. They feel very comfortable with that environment. They feel like they've settled and found their happy spot at home. And so, what does that mean for the future of a company? We have 3 offices in different cities. We intend to return to work, but we have a workforce that are fully grounded at home and happy. And when you're hiring new people, they're also saying, "Hey, I want to be remote forever." And so, how do you build a company culture in a remote environment? I think that's really challenging. Also, tech staffing has just always been hard, but I feel like the last year has been extra challenging, especially hiring software or hardware engineers. I don't think that the US is producing enough engineers to satisfy the demand. And what happened during COVID was very interesting. Everybody went online with their business. So restaurants now are hiring software engineers. Like restaurant chains are saying, I need to hire software engineers. I was talking to somebody at a really large pharmacy chain in the US, and they told me, oh, we have 120 open positions for engineers. And I said, that's for 2021. They said, no, that's for this quarter.
Wow.
It's a pharmacy chain. They have pharmacies all over the US, but they're hiring 120 engineers. That's pretty crazy. That would not have happened last year or the year before. That's because everything is drastically going digital. So it's a really good time to be an engineer, but it is very challenging to hire. And connecting with candidates and getting enough time from them to tell them why they should join your company as opposed to the 10 other companies that's giving them job offers is hard.
Well, thanks for sharing the trend. I think a lot of people are curious about post-COVID, how would that impact the job market? You shared some, specific things happening. So how do you describe a culture of a startup, and what is the culture of your company? And are you hiring?
Yes, we are hiring. I'll get that out of the way. We have a website where we post all our jobs. Of the 5 startups that I worked at, the culture in all of them were very, very different. Unfortunately, some of them were very dysfunctional. And I think that was pretty typical of a 90s or zero startup in the 2000s, as to have a large component of the company culture be either dysfunctional or borderline toxic. And it's typically because people with very different backgrounds and mindsets come together to start a company. These days, I think it's changed a lot. Startups and startup teams have grown up to know that they need to invest in culture, values, and people development. So I think it's a lot better, but still there's a lot of diversity. So what I think is super challenging is if you are considering joining a startup and interviewing for a remote position or even an office position, learning about the culture. How do you do that over Zoom? How do you do that in 4 or 5 interviews? I think that's really challenging. Our company has values that we try to instill in our day-to-day work to make sure that when we do have issues with the product or we have challenges with the customer or something goes wrong, that we can fall back on those values and understand how to use those values to solve the problem. Because when everything goes well, it's great and everybody is happy. But when you do hit those bumps, which happen, what do you fall back on to be able to solve the problem? There's always experience, but even the most experienced people can be difficult to work with. Some people are entitled. Some people are not great communicators. I'm come from software engineering. I wasn't a great communicator when I first entered the job market. I was terrible at communicating, but I had to learn that skill. So if you can't rely on great communication or great leadership, how do you solve a problem at all levels of the company? Well, that's the values of the company and the culture. And so that's a long topic, but we try to maintain a healthy culture, and we try to do it in this really remote environment, which is new for all of us, and we're still learning every day.
I have a question from the audience. Do you think there's a correlation in between the jobs at home and the pay rate?
There is definitely trends that's emerging. So we import a tremendous amount of job pay data to be able to make successful offers. One of the worst things you can do is invest in interviews, 5 or 6 hours of interviews. And when you get to the job offer process and you don't make a successful job offer, you lose the candidate, right? So all of that time is wasted. We also try to have the compensation conversation right at the front. And then people are like, this is weird. You haven't even interviewed me and you're trying to set expectations. So the natural inclination or the preference for candidates is to hear about money and benefits at the end of the interview process when they're more receptive. And so the trends that's emerging from all the data that we import is really strange and all over the map. For engineering functions, software and hardware engineering, there is a very robust baseline of pay And offers all look very similar, and they're all trending drastically upwards. And nowadays, companies are hiring hardware and software engineers without any affordance for at home or in office. The pay rate is just standard across the board, and there really isn't a difference. But in other functions, like somebody call center operations, for example, or administrative functions, finance, there are two types of offers that you're seeing, those for permanently work from home and those for in office, and there's significantly less for permanently work from home. So the more traditional roles that are not highly competitive, we are seeing a trend emerge where there's a gap between the work from home and the in office positions. And companies are specifically hiring for remote positions for the purpose of saving money. And the intention for companies usually to hire engineers is to expand their engineering force and to meet engineering demand. And so they don't try to save money, they just try to fill the position. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And not only that, you explained what are your observation of the trend as well as the rationale behind it. Thanks for that. I'd like to conclude our talk today by asking the very last question, that for those students who are getting ready to graduate and move on to the next chapter, what advice would you like to share with them?
Wow, that's a tough one. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes and think about what I would like to tell you, knowing what I know specifically about the tech market. I'm not an expert at some of the other market. I know some about healthcare recruiting, especially doctors and nurses, because we work in that area. So I guess what I would say is internships are still a really, really good way to learn about companies. Don't expect to learn something from the actual internship job, but having the ability to be in a company and then learn about all the other stuff is really valuable. So while you're an intern, for example, you could learn more about the job offer process. You could talk to HR or other people who recently joined the company and get their feedback and experience about how was it to enter the job market as an applicant, and then how they converted into a full-time position. But if an internship is not available, or maybe it doesn't fit into your timeline, I would say don't underinvest in researching companies, and research on a set of questions that you think is important to you to ask during the interview process, and drive really hard to get those answers. So, give you some examples. Ask about the company's approach to remote and in-person culture. How are they going to maintain the culture of the company with so many people remote? Because that's kind of the status quo now. Most organizations are work from home. Maybe you care about your career. Maybe you're thinking that you will be at the company for 3 to 5 years. Ask about how they do employee evaluations, at what cadence do they do it, how do they decide how to pay out a bonus, for example. These sounds like obvious questions, and you may feel insecure asking them, but you really need to do your research on where you join, because it's a wild west we live in now. And some companies are thriving with this remote workforce, but most are struggling. And I don't think you want to dedicate 6 to 12 or more months to finding out that it's not a fit for you. So focus on as many questions as you can think of that's important to you to make sure that it's a good fit. And don't just look at the job offer and the pay.
Yeah, the interview process is almost it's a matching game for on both sides, right?
Yeah.
Both the candidate and the company. So thank you, Kobus, for spending time with us and sharing your incredible journey, and we really appreciate it.
Great. And thank you for having me. Have a great day.